Good morning, Central Florida, and welcome to the Dewitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM and AM 580 WDBO. I am attorney Mo Dewitt joining you this morning, and again with me, once again, is attorney Jacob Stuart. Now, Jake, I didn't expect to have you back this soon. We love having you here. For those just joining us, the past few weeks, we've been covering the trial of the state of Florida versus Charlie Adelson in the case, or the murder, I should say, Professor Dan Markel at Florida State College of Law. As we covered last week, Charlie was found guilty on all three counts, and we've had a new revelation happen since that occurred. Something that was a bit unexpected, but maybe not so unexpected. Can you inform our listeners what's happened since Dr. Adelson was found guilty here?
First of all, it's great to be back with you, Moses, and be part of your wonderful show sharing with the Central Florida community about what's happening in law and offering the services. Not that we offer advice, as you said, but it's a great resource for the community.
Well, I think it's important for people to kind of stay informed of what's going on, and I do find this interesting personally. It's quite the saga, as far as murder trials go, and it's certainly out of the ordinary.
Well, so for our viewers and listeners to kind of catch them up, is that this is a case that has caught national attention, and most recently it was all over the news in regards to, as you said, Charlie Adelson and his trial, a very prominent South Florida dental, or in the dentist industry, I guess.
Yeah, periodontist, I believe.
Periodontist. I'm hoping I never have to see a periodontist, but evidently if you do, they were the family to go to. Very successful series of practices. And after he was convicted, remember, like we talked about, his sentencing was postponed because he had no prior criminal history.
Right.
He then had, according to the state, a phone call with his mother while in jail. And on this call, evidently, the state was listening, as you may suspect. And on this call, his mother said, "Don't worry about anything. I've got trust set up for everyone. And I'm contemplating either suicide or traveling to a country with no extradition." And evidently, according to the state now, through the actual elected state attorney up in Leon County, she had been a target, meaning Charlie Adelson's mother, Donna Adelson.
Right.
And that they expedited the grand jury proceedings to have her indicted because they knew she was going to try to run. And she actually was arrested at the Miami International Airport with a one-way ticket to Dubai with a connection then to Vietnam. Evidently there's no extradition.
Right.
I think it's important for listeners to view just in general and context. A state attorney has a right in capital offenses to convene a grand jury. And what a grand jury is versus a normal jury, you think from TV, is a jury that meets in private and in total confidentiality.
Right.
There's no judge. There's no defense lawyer. You as the accused have no right to present any evidence, just a state attorney with a group of people. In capital offenses, which would be capital sexual battery or first-degree murder, they can convene, and that's what they did in this case.
And so, first of all, I think it's important to refresh the audience's recollection that Donna Adelson was supposed to be a witness in this trial of Charlie Adelson. She put them on notice that she was going to plead the fifth to anything that she testified to, and ultimately she was not called because of that. So obviously she was at least a person of interest, if not a co-conspirator at that point. But in your opinion, why do you think they waited until after they got the conviction in this case to then convene the grand jury? Why not do it all together?
It's a good question. Two potential answers, I would think, Moses. One is that they may have thought they didn't have a strong enough case against Wendy Adelson, and they wanted to really, it's like, pick the lowest hanging fruit and go for one they think they get with Charlie. Because remember, in Charlie's case, which I imagine we'll talk about in a little bit like we talked about before, they had a recorded call with him at a restaurant with his ex-girlfriend at the time, Katie.
And, not to cut you off, this whole case really centers, at least with the Adelsons, on the recordings and the calls that they had. I mean, they kind of dug their own grave with what they said here.
And that's where I was going with the second idea, is that they didn't have enough evidence to convict her, maybe. And on second, they wanted to see if they can convict him and then see what he would say to her on a recorded call.
Which is what happened.
And it's almost like, and here's, I think, a life lesson for all listener and viewers, that no matter how much money you have or how educated you have, people sometimes do incredibly stupid things. So you are to go to the best schools, all the money, all these things. And the first thing you do when you get convicted is have a phone call with your mother, and your mother, who is potentially a target investigation, talks about leaving the country where they can't go back and get her.
And they have to know these are recorded, right? I mean, we've
Yes.
talked about this on prior shows not related to this case. Every jail call is recorded. That's one thing that, if you're ever arrested, don't say anything on the calls because they're recorded. They can use them against you.
One of the very first things when families come to engage me and their son or loved one or daughter is in custody, the first thing I say is we all have to have an agreement that 100% we're not going to allow anyone to talk about the case on the phone, including the attorneys. Because you are right. There are actually, like here and locally, in prior administrations of the state attorney, there were volunteer people who would come in just to listen to phone calls of people accused of serious crimes, hoping they'd slip up. Think about that. Just volunteers. And now, not including artificial intelligence and way to do data scraping, they can pick up and look for certain words and recordings.
Right.
And you're in a difficult situation. But going back to this, I mean, we talked about it off air before we were getting ready. You just can't make this up. And,
No, you really can't.
And as a defense lawyer or someone who always tries to see the best in people, it's horrible what happened to Dan Markel. Obviously, anyone who's taken from this, especially with young children, your life being ended early is horrible.
Yeah, I mean, it was all over, a horrible divorce and a fight over custody, and the guy ends up losing his life because of this.
But I felt bad for Charlie Adelson after the trial.
Well, that's because you're a criminal defense attorney.
I just felt bad for him. And then, when I found out about Donna Adelson, when you actually let me know about it, you texted me. I just felt bad for. Think about this. This prominent family now is just disintegrating.
Well, and their kids. I mean,
Right.
the children are the real victim. They've lost their father. They're losing, an uncle, potentially a grandmother. I mean, their family's been destroyed by this, incredibly stupid and horrible act, frankly.
Right. And I think, Donna, the thing is, as of, us recording this conversation today, we know she's in the Miami County jail.
Right.
We know she's on no bond. And so when you get arrested within 24 hours under Florida's Constitution, you have to be in front of a judge. It's called initial appearance. And he or she as a judge has to determine whether or not there was probable cause to have you arrested. We were able to ascertain or get the actual affidavit for the warrant, which is what we're using the basis for a lot of our discussion. But she's not, her case, meaning Donna Adelson's case, has not populated the clerk of the court.
Right.
And she has to be moved from Miami or Broward County Dade County up to Leon County within a certain amount of time. Otherwise, they may have to release her. Now, of course, they're going to come pick her up.
Right.
But this is the kind of situation where she's in a holding pattern. She has a right to attorney. She has a right to a bond, but she at least is going to be in custody for at least another month. And probably if they charge her with first-degree murder, they're probably going to try to hold her just like they did Charlie until she goes to trial.
Well, and I want to get into the contents of that warrant. And I want to talk more about, potential bond and what she's looking at there. But first, I want to I want to go back and play a clip from the trial, which I thought was interesting listening to it now, because it kind of foreshadows a little bit of this. So let me go ahead and play that clip.
Example,
Okay. But
not a flight number.
But he didn't put flying to New York tomorrow on this occasion.
No.
You were referenced several times, not on direct examination by the state, but by your brother's attorney on cross as a co-conspirator. Are you charged in this case?
No.
This isn't your trial, is it?
No.
Is your brother charged with conspiring with you to do a murder?
No.
Is he charged with conspiring with you to plan a murder?
No.
Is he charged with soliciting you to do a murder?
No.
Who is he charged with doing those things with?
I don't think anyone.
Have you had an opportunity to review his indictment in this case?
I have not.
Give you an opportunity to take a look at that document to yourself. Who is your brother alleged to have done these crimes with?
Catherine D. Magbanowa.
Were you on the wire in this case, Ms. Adelson?
No.
So when the bump happened, are you familiar with the event I'm referencing as the bump?
I am now.
when law enforcement approached your mother on the street and handed her a piece of paper?
Yes.
Okay, when that occurred, who did your mother call?
I don't know.
Not you, right?
Not me.
Okay. And once your brother found out about the bump, did he call you about it?
No.
Who did he call?
I don't know.
Well, you listened to the calls to authenticate the voices, didn't you?
Just to hear the voices, not to hear the content of the calls.
Okay. And the voices were your brother's voice, right?
But I listened to the calls just to hear who was on them, so I don't know what content they're referencing.
I heard your answer. My question to you now is, your brother's voice was on the calls.
He was on some of the calls I listened to.
Okay. Your mother's voice was on the calls.
She was on some of the calls I listened to.
Did you have any secret meetings with your brother post bump that happened in South Florida?
No.
So that was the testimony of Wendy Adelson, the sister of Charlie Adelson, and of course the daughter of Donna Adelson. And I thought it was kind of interesting the way the state attorney goes through there and basically is asking, who are the co-conspirators here, making it very clear to the jury that she is not, meaning Wendy is not considered to be a co-conspirator, at least at this point in time. But they do go through the phone calls and the bump, and Donna Adelson is mentioned there.
Right, and let's remember for viewers and listeners who may have not been part of the first shows that we talked about this. So the murder happens of Dan Markel, and they kind of hit some dead ends after potentially some issues in the investigation. And so what law enforcement did in coordination with the FBI was actually approach Donna Adelson and give her a piece of paper that says, we know what you did involving Markel, something to that effect, and you need to pay us $5,000, and here's the phone number to call us.
And she calls that phone number.
Right. But before she does, though, she actually then calls her son, Charlie Adelson. Charlie then, and this is laid out in the actual affidavit for the warrant in terms of establishing how she was part of this conspiracy. And this is what, going back to your earlier question, which I think you're right on the money, that they're foreshadowing this cross-examination or directive, Wendy Adelson, meaning Donna's the mother, Wendy's and Charlie are the two kids, is that Donna somehow was really part of this. And in fact, she may have been arguably the mastermind of everything.
Right.
That she may have known that Charlie had, because like we talked about, Charlie, for all intents and purposes, as he testified, he loved his sister, but wasn't particularly close with her.
Right.
The mother may have had known that Charlie was dating, a girl that had connections to the quote unquote Miami gang world. And that came out through the evidence also is actually in the probable cause affidavit. And so the FBI using this bump to create these situations where people start talking on recorded lines, because when they did the bump, for your listeners, they also had a warrant from a judge to record the calls of Charlie Adelson, Wendy Adelson, and Donna Adelson.
And I mean, without those calls, without that information, those recordings, do they have a case against the Adelsons?
No. I mean, they may have had, there's a difference of thinking of someone did a crime versus thinking you're saying you can prove a crime.
Right.
Right. So from my personal experience in trying over 100 jury trials, without those recorded calls and without that recorded statement of Charlie Adelson right after the bump with his ex-girlfriend at the time, Katie, there is no way they could prove the case, because essentially it would just be other people's words and no physical evidence whatsoever. But it's really remarkable, though, going back to it, though, that if you're approaching the street and someone says to you, you better call this number and pay $5,000, why not call your lawyer? Call Mo, right? I mean, call somebody.
Call anybody, yeah. Or call the police.
Yes,
that's the other big issue.
But my instinct is I tell all my good friends and family, before you call the police, unless there's a real emergency, the first call is have your lawyer on the phone when you call the police. But what I think it would be used to use to show is that the state would intend to use, this is not what innocent people do. Right.
But that's still not proving guilt. Right. That's not proving guilt.
You're correct.
But let's talk about that. Let's talk about, whether she had a lawyer and what she did wrong here. Right when we come back from this break, we are covering I guess it was the trial of Charlie Adelson. Now we're covering the
indictment.
The indictment of Donna Adelson. And of course, it's all related to the murder of Dan Markel. This is the Dewitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM and AM 580 WDBO.
About 1 year ago, I got a car accident. I'm so panicked, I don't know what to do. And then I asked my son, so they said, oh, call Mo. I said, okay, I call. And then after that, so everything that Mo take care of. So everybody need a lawyer, call on Mo. He's the best in Orlando. Injured I go, just more, okay? The best. Everything you have problem, you just call. My experience with Dewitt Home is 100% great, 110% great, real great. The team, Casey and Jennifer, they are good. They are real good. Call more. Everything handled. Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Dewitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM and AM 580 WDBO. I'm attorney Mo DeWitt. Again, joining me this morning is attorney Jacob Stuart, and we are covering the indictment of Donna Adelson related to the murder of Professor Dan Markel from Florida State College of Law. Now, for those of you just joining us, Donna Adelson is currently being held in the Miami jail. She was picked up while trying to, what appears to be trying to flee to Vietnam, which is a non-extradition country. She's currently in the Miami jail. I don't believe she has any bond at this point in time.
No, she doesn't.
Had a bond hearing. So, Jake, in your experience, you're a criminal defense attorney. You've dealt with these kinds of cases many times. Given that she was on her way out of the country, she certainly has the means. Do you see a judge granting her any sort of pretrial release here, any sort of bond?
It'd be really hard. I think that, there's certain extenuating circumstances you can put on to mitigate the risk of someone fleeing, one being a GPS monitor.
Right.
One is the, revocation or turning over of a passport. But in this case, if you have someone who's supposedly worth multi-millions of dollars, it's very, very hard. Now, the argument obviously is that there's been plenty of people, even recently in the news, who have been tried, who are worth a lot of money, who would stay in the country. But this is pretty incredible. I think actually being picked up on a one-way ticket. And one of the things to think about, and I was just, when you said that, it's funny that Vietnam, we don't have extradition with them when considering America's history with Vietnam.
Right.
But there are certain countries you can go to that they won't honor if there is a warrant for your arrest from other countries. And so most countries you would think of, like if you go to any of the countries of the EU, European Union, or Japan, Canada, even Mexico, they have extradition. But it's a pretty damning thing, Moses, for sure.
So, I mean, most likely she's probably going to remain in jail until she goes to trial, which could be years. I think Charlie was in jail for several years now. Part of that was due to COVID. And he was he had no bond while waiting for these charges. I assume because they thought he was a flight risk as well, given his, financial ability to flee the country and possibly disappear.
The only difference I'd say is for listeners and viewers to consider is that one is that she's older.
Right.
Two is that you to a certain extent, Charlie's evidence that held him on a no bond status is different than hers. Even if she conspired and did all these things, or even knew about the murder, the question is, did she actually give the order to Katie or to Garcia Rivera to actually kill Markel, right? So if she had been aware of it or helped pay for it, that may be different, though, than being the key orchestrator of it. And so I think from the perspective, if I was her defense lawyer, that you could argue Charlie Adelson is much more guilty of anything than she is. And she may, we haven't listened to the phone call. We've only read the highlights from the affidavit. She may have thought something was coming. But she has a right to travel. That is one thing that is true.
Even on a one-way ticket?
Yeah, even on a one-way ticket.
So, I mean, if this goes to trial, when this goes to trial, will it be admissible that she tried to flee the country on a one-way ticket?
I think the state's definitely going to try to do that. Under Florida law, just like the United States, you have an absolute right to remain silent, meaning they can't force you to speak against yourself. But actions that could be interpreted as manifestations of guilt or a sign of a guilty conscience sometimes are admissible, right? So if I was the defense lawyer, I would argue that has no relevancy whatsoever. They have to be able to tie that nexus between traveling. So if she says on the jail call, I'm leaving because I'm guilty and I'm never coming back because I don't want them to get me, that may be different than I'm in fear they're going to charge me, even though I'm innocent and I'm not. I now know the law has failed you, Charlie. I'm not going to let the law fail me. Do you see that? That's a different perspective.
Right. If she's just afraid of being indicted, she's seen her son sit in jail for several years.
And so from her perspective, maybe she's thinking, this whole system has failed. I've only got a few years relatively left to live. She's in an older station in her life. So I would fight like hell, if I can say that on the radio, that to keep that out, because certainly if a jury hears that, it's horrible news. And as you said, the one-way ticket to Dubai, to Vietnam, it's just not a good thing.
Once again, her own words are probably the most damning evidence that they have. We'll dive more into that when we get back from this break. You're listening to the DeWitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM and AM 580.
I had stopped, and for some reason I look up and I see the headlights coming up, and I knew he wasn't going to stop. I'm just sitting there bracing for it, and sure enough, bam. And a couple days later, I woke up and said, oh no, my neck was hurting, back is hurting, and I felt hopeless. I didn't know what to do because I thought it was over. Maybe in that moment, was I supposed to call someone? At this point, is it too late? And I went on the internet. First thing that pops up is Dewitt. And I said, okay, I'll give him a call. We'll see what happens. I don't know about lawyers, because I was the same person. I was afraid of it, to be honest. I thought maybe I'd have to pay them if I lost. I just didn't know how it worked. I think the biggest thing that I can say that DeWitt helped me with was holding my hand through the process of treatment. They actually were able to refer doctors to go to. I got help with my MRIs, with all the scans we had to do on the neck. So there was so much that goes into a car crash process that I truly just didn't know. If you've been hit, call. Simple as that. Because you don't have to do it alone. There's people like the DeWitt Law Firm that will help. If you're injured on the go, just call Mo.
Welcome back to the DeWitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM and AM 580 WDBO. I'm attorney Mo DeWitt. Again, joining me this morning is attorney Jacob Stuart. Jake, if people want to get a hold of you, can you let them know how to do so?
I can be reached 24/7 on my main number at 407-545-6416. Even after hours, you have a call forwarding service, goes right to my cell phone, or they could Google me at Jacob Stuart Law, and all my contact information pops up as well.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your insight on this case. If you're just joining us, we're covering the indictment of Donna Adelson related to the murder of Professor Dan Markel from Florida State College of Law. Before the break, we were talking about how basically loose lips sink ships, and that's what's happened in this case with both Charlie and now Donna. And I wanted to play a clip from Charlie Adelson's trial where they actually play the phone call between Donna Adelson and the undercover FBI agent and get your take on that.
And before, if I could, Moses, just for the listeners to keep in mind when this is an undercover agent saying that he's trying to allegedly extort her to try to get her to talk about her knowledge of the killing of Markel.
Right, exactly.
Hello? This is Mrs. Adelson. Is this Sammy? Sammy. Okay. My grandchildren had my phone before, so I.
Is it Adelson?
I'm Mrs. Adelson.
Yes.
Yeah. My grandchildren had my phone before, so that's, and I just saw that you called.
Oh, okay. You left a message on my voicemail.
Right, I did.
Yeah.
This is my problem. You approached me on Alton Road. You handed me an article from the newspaper about my ex-son-in-law. You told me I need to call you and help your friend who was in prison. Now, at the time you did that, I didn't understand what you were talking about. I didn't call you back. Then you mailed me a threatening letter. Then you send me a text message to my phone that says I'm not taking you seriously. So I am taking you seriously. And I really want you to listen to me. I have to tell you, I mean, this is important. I have been so stressed out. I have spoken to 10 or 12 people who are close friends of mine, telling them about this and basically picking their brains and asking them what I should do, because I don't know your friend who is in jail. You mentioned a name. I don't even know his name. I never spoke to him. I don't know what he looks like. I've never met him. I'm sorry your friend's in jail, but I don't know what that has to do with me.
You know exactly what it has to do with. You know exactly what. Listen to me carefully. Listen to me. Listen to me. You just got to listen to me.
You need to ask your friend who this person looks like, what their name is, something, because I know there's a big reward out there, and if you need money for your friend, that's the way to get it. I mean, I'm asking you nicely. I don't know who he is. I am out of the loop. It is not me. If I can help, I would help. I mean, that's what.
So that was the voice of Donna Adelson saying she's out of the loop. She has no information, but she obviously calls this FBI agent back as part of this bump. As a criminal defense attorney, what do you make of that, Jake?
My immediate reaction, again, I know I'm biased, is that what a gross use of federal money to be recording someone.
Well, I mean, ultimately, it could lead to a conviction here. It's one of their main pieces of evidence.
I understand that. I just that's my you wanted my immediate reaction, and now being more thoughtful and not letting my true colors point out. I mean, the officer clearly was egging her on, and that I think for listeners and viewers, think about this. Not only did the FBI give her a piece of newspaper, the phone number, they then send her a letter. They then send her a text message, right? It's this kind of, drip.
They keep coming after her, yeah.
Really, really trying, and that would make me think they really, really think that she's involved, but lacked real evidence.
Of course,
And
yeah.
so in this case in particular, if we were to presume the state's case from that evidence, that she was insulated, meaning the only person she talked to about this really was Charlie. She never talked to Wendy. Presumably, she never talked to her husband. We don't have any evidence to suggest that. But most importantly, she never talked to Rivera Garcia directly. From all intents and purposes, their testimony was all about the dentist, meaning Charlie. They never knew the mother was involved if she was involved. And so this is their way of trying to get her to break away from that. If you think about it like from Goodfellas, right? What was one of the big pieces of advice is that the boss only talked to one guy, right?
Insulation.
And that's that kind of idea here that her insulation was Charlie. And she, had before this call, Charlie had not been put on trial. But now going back to why would she make that call to him in jail? It made that she feels guilty, right? It made that she feels, remember, this is still her son.
Of course.
Right?
You never want something bad to happen to your children.
But that bump call in particular is really interesting because as a lawyer, when she says, I talked to other people about this, my first thought is, okay, we know you talked to Charlie about it, but who else you talked to about it?
Right, because she says 10 to 12 other people.
Right. So let's go find out who those people are. And remember, for listeners and viewers, the state had listed Donna Adelson and Harvey Adelson, her husband, Charlie's and Wendy's father, as witnesses. And right before the trial started, after the jury had been picked, the state had announced that they weren't going to call them anymore because they had, through their lawyers, invoked their right to remain silent. And remember, under Florida law, a husband or wife, and under our new partnerships, this also applies to spouses. You cannot be compelled to testify against your spouse.
Except in limited circumstances.
Right. In limited circumstances. But in a criminal case like this, they can't bring Harvey in, meaning her husband, to come testify her. But like you said, let's say she did talk to Wendy. Let's say she did talk to Charlie. Let's say she did talk to her son, or I'm sorry, her husband. That's at least 7 other people now, if we're going to believe that, she actually talked to about this case. So as a law enforcement officer, I'm thinking, okay, let's now go look at her phone records since the bump call, meaning since the first time we put the bump on you in the street to this call. Let's go look at all of your calls now and zero in on who you've talked to, right? And that's kind of something that they may be doing. We only have the tip of the iceberg of what they have now. And who knows? I mean, based upon her standard of conduct, Moses, she may be calling people in the jail right now. Now, interestingly enough, if she were to call her husband right now in jail, from jail, that would not be immune, meaning it's on a recorded line. And that would be totally admissible in a trial.
Now, I mean, I would assume that she had a lawyer throughout this process, or at least throughout part of this process. You know, she knew enough to plead the fifth, to not testify at Charlie's trial. Obviously, I would assume her lawyer's not advising her to flee the country. I mean, what was she thinking? I mean, you would think her lawyer advised her not to, give this kind of information on a recorded call with Charlie. She had to know that they were recorded, I would think. I guess it's just people do stupid things.
I think so. I mean, we know she had a lawyer as of 3 weeks ago, right? Because that lawyer contacted the court about her right to remain silent in that invocation of the right. I think, again, this case is a great example of poor, rich, white, black, Hispanic, purple, whatever your color is, whatever your creed is, that sometimes raw emotion can just make you do things that are totally illogical.
Or fear. I mean, it could be fear as well.
Or fear. But I mean, in this case in particular, obviously we can't put ourselves in the mind of Donna Adelson.
That's true.
But her conduct, people who are 65 or 70 typically just don't decide to commit a murder.
Typically.
Right.
And again, they still have to prove their case here. This is just an indictment. But, looking at this trial, which may occur, a year or two from now, what does the evidence look like? Obviously, with the case of Charlie Adelson, one of the star witnesses was Luis Rivera, which was basically the driver. He drove from Miami with the shooter to Tallahassee, where the murders occurred. Unless they can get Charlie to flip on Donna Adelson, I would assume they're really left with these recordings from this bump and the jail phone calls, whatever those may show. In your opinion, what are they going to use to try to prove this conspiracy here?
A few things. One is we know from the last trial of Charlie Adelson that when his ex-girlfriend testified about being paid, she testified that the fact that the mother, meaning Donna Adelson, had actually, and this is not a metaphor, had literally washed the money before giving it to them to pay for allegedly, the murder of Markel.
Okay.
And so I think if they tie together the fact that she provided the money or cash money out of the operating account or savings account or sold stocks or whatever to pay for it, the reason she would pay for it is, of course, because she was involved in the setup of the murder. The other thing to think about, and I know this may sound complicated, but just listeners and viewers, think about it this way. After she gets the first bump in the probable cause affidavit, meaning, remember, she was approached on the street with a phone number, the news article saying, "I know what you did." What's the first thing her phone records show that she did? They show that she calls Charlie Adelson. And then Charlie Adelson, within 30 seconds of that call with his mother, what does he do? He calls his ex-girlfriend. And then after talking to his ex-girlfriend, who was the connection to the gang, what does then Charlie Adelson do? He calls his mother right back. And so typically when you're building probable cause, a logical deduction would be that in an inference that the state would be allowed to argue to the jury is, when you're calling someone and they call someone else involved in the murder and then call you right back within 30 seconds, of course you're talking about the murder.
Right.
You're not talking about the weather or how much you love, certain ways your gums look in certain pictures. What you're talking about in all seriousness, though, is that about the subject at hand, because there's no other reason you would follow that linear progression of conduct. And so, like we've talked about before, while motive and intent motive is not required in a murder case or a conspiracy case, it certainly helps prove.
It's helpful to the jury to understand why.
And it helps provide a narrative. You think about it this way. It's like a state attorney presents all these stars like to a jury, like in the night sky, and then in closing arguments, they draw constellations, right? If you think about it that way, all these pieces of evidence maybe kind of are confusing and they're vague or not quite clear, but what the state's showing is that they're all under the prism or constellation that they were in this dire situation. She desperately wanted her two grandsons and her daughter to move back to Florida. So much so, emails show, and this is all in the probable cause affidavit, she offered Markel over $1 million.
And they talked about that in the trial a little bit as well.
Not only that, they talk about in some of the emails, which defense argued, of course, in a nasty divorce, and you would know better than I, meaning not that you've been divorced, you're happily married.
No, but we've handled a lot of divorces.
Right, that sometimes people say and do things they really don't mean in a divorce. And so one of the emails that, Donald Adelson talked about this idea that, Markel was a devout Jewish person, and that she would change the faith of the boys to Catholic to try to get him back.
Which can be a common thing in divorces. We've had that happen.
Right,
before.
and so they're piling on these little things to show, and they go back again. Remember, the state made this whole thing about how Charlie Adelson made a bad joke about, from the defense's point of view, that he bought his sister a $5,000 TV because it was cheaper than a hitman.
Right.
It's now come out that Donna, that the state argues there was no TV that was bought, and that there was code between Donna, the mother, and Charlie after the bump call about the TV, meaning that was actually code for the hitman. And on top of that, the state talks about in the probable cause affidavit, the day Mr. Markel was killed, there was a TV repairman at Wendy's house, Adelson house. And so their whole point is there was no TV. This was all something.
All code.
And it may actually be, that may be the chink in the armor that brings Wendy Adelson into this too.
That she could possibly have known it based on that code.
Because remember, the minutes after the jury verdict came back against Charlie Adelson, one of the first questions asked by the press corps is, are there more charges coming? And she actually joked, can you just give me a minute to celebrate this? But then she said, I think we talked about this, stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
And
that's where we'll leave it right here. Stay tuned. We're up against our last commercial break. You're listening to the DeWitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM, AM 580, WDBO.
So I got a call from a guy last night who was in a pretty bad car accident. He was behind a work truck, essentially. Some items fell off the work truck, went through his windshield, smashed up his windshield, and hurt his hand really bad. So the insurance company reached out to him right after the accident, and he was at first concerned about getting his windshield fixed. I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but his hand was all banged up and really needed to see a doctor about his hand, especially because he does construction work and that's kind of his livelihood. But he was concerned about getting his car fixed, getting it back on the road so he could start driving. So the insurance company sent him some paperwork and he signed it. And the problem is that paperwork was a release. So basically, he released the at-fault party from any and all liability for a little over $400, basically, which means he can never go after them again. So he called us to see if we can help them. Unfortunately, in this case, we can't help him. He released the other side completely, and frankly, there's nothing we can do. And that's why it's always so important that you speak to an attorney before you ever sign any paperwork with the insurance company. Worst case scenario is the attorney's gonna say, yep, you're good to sign it, good to go. Worst case, or best case scenario, it'll save you from something like this. So before you ever sign a release, before you ever sign any paperwork with the insurance company, reach out to an injury attorney. Most injury attorneys won't charge you a dime to talk to you and take a look at that and try to help you with it. Unfortunately for this individual, it's a little too late, but hopefully somebody else out there can learn from his story and hopefully avoid making the same mistake he did.
Welcome back to the DeWitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM and AM 580 WDBO. I'm attorney Mo DeWitt, joined by attorney Jacob Stuart this morning, and I want to jump right back into it, Jake. As we stated before the break, after the conviction of Charlie Adelson, the prosecutor, the state attorney here, said, stay tuned as to whether there will be other indictments. Obviously now Donna Adelson is indicted. She was caught basically fleeing to Vietnam, a non-extradition country, with her husband. She's now been arrested and placed in the Miami-Dade County Jail. The husband has not faced any charges. Do you expect Harvey Adelson to face any charges? Is he guilty of anything for fleeing to Vietnam with her?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think if he was a target of the investigation and he had a one-way ticket as well to go to a non-extradition country, they would have arrested him on some nonsense charge or throwaway charge to try to keep him here. So there's been no evidence to support that, but it's hard for me to imagine that a wife could orchestrate something like this without the husband having any idea about it. But maybe she did, who knows in that regard.
Well, and he may, but they may not have the proof. I mean, from what we know so far, it's her voice on these bump calls.
There is no evidence to support that Harvey Adelson had any involvement in this whatsoever. And I think to answer your question directly, if they had any evidence, they would have tried to tie him in and have him arrested at the airport just like Donna was.
Gotcha. Well, I guess we'll see if if there's future indictments waiting for him, or if they're going to proceed with just the trial of Donna Adelson at this point.
And I think on the other indictment issue, I'm sorry to cut you off, Moses, it's your show, but Wendy Adelson, the Markel's ex, I think there's something there too. We talked about it in the prior segment about this idea that there had been made a code language in the family about TVs,
right,
and
TV
all of that,
repairman.
right? And I think that's something there, and I think I think that'll be for us to see. And we now know this family has a history of saying things on recorded calls. So, like I've talked about before, that you want, as a lawyer, you want to make sure your clients don't speak on the phone about anything. And it's hard where you're incarcerated, right? Because all you want to do is talk about the reason you're in jail, but you can't. So typically, in my experience, people who are arrested within the first 24 hours usually say something and is not what they should have said, especially in cases where they may be in raw emotion and disbelief. I mean, you've got to think, in 3 weeks, she saw her son get convicted and is going to be sentenced to life in prison. And now she's trying to desperately flee, talking about potentially even hurting or killing herself and being arrested at the airport. It can really do things to your psyche and make you say things and specifically do things you normally wouldn't.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to get into, what's the difference here if the state can prove that she knew about the murder beforehand versus if she learned about who actually committed the murder after? Let's say Charlie was the mastermind here, but then Charlie confessed this to her after the murder had taken place.
So she's been charged, my understanding is, on the exact same 3 counts as Charlie has. So if she only knew after it happened, and let's say she was trying to help him cover it up, she could be charged essentially, potentially with accessory to murder, but not with murder itself or the solicitation of someone to come murder, which she's charged with. So if they only can prove she was after it, it could be either obstruction of justice to a certain extent or some type of accessory to a murder, maybe. But in this case, it would appear to me that the evidence would support that because they're charging her with first-degree murder at this point, and a grand jury came back with that indictment, they have evidence, whether that's through phone calls, texts, emails, or some other type of evidence, maybe it's money trail, that actually she was involved beforehand. So it would have a big ramification. Now, ultimately, if she's charged with obstruction of justice with a first-degree or life felony or with after the fact, that can still lead to, what is the equivalent of life in prison for someone her age. So either way, it's serious, but it's a good nuance for listening viewers to think about.
And I think, based on the evidence we've heard so far from the defense perspective, there could be an argument that could be made if the defense puts up a theory, which, again, they're not required to do so. But if they put up a theory that maybe she only learned about it after the fact because all these recordings took place afterwards.
And every time, you're right, and every time I think if I was a defense lawyer for her, a change of venue would need to happen. I mean, if you've now tried this case and the fact pattern 4 times in Leon County, how is she supposed to get a fair trial there? And I think that's, every little bit. If I'm hoping she hires a brand new lawyer, because clearly the lawyers they aren't working or she's not listening to their advice. But they really need to think about how can she get a fair trial in Leon County where it's not been 1, not been 2, not been 3, but 4 nationally and internationally publicized trials in a very small relative county.
And this will be the 5th trial of this case. The prosecutor is certainly well experienced with it, but given how publicized it has been in Tallahassee, in Leon County, you're right, finding a fair and impartial jury could be very difficult. Jake, thank you for joining us this morning.
You bet, Moses.
We greatly appreciate your insight on this case. You're listening to the DeWitt Law Review right here on 107.3 FM and AM 580